Mary Oliver, and it is simply called Poem, but its subtitle is The Spirit Likes to Dress Up. The spirit likes to dress up like this. 10 fingers, 10 toes, shoulders, and all the rest. At night, in the black branches, in the morning, in the blue branches of the world. It could float, of course, but would rather plumb through rough matter, airy and shapeless thing. It needs the metaphor of the body. Lime and appetite, the oceanic fluids. It needs the body's world, instinct and imagination, and the dark hug of time. Sweetness and tangibility, to be understood, to be more than pure light that burns where no one is. So it enters us in the morning, shines from brute comfort like a stitch of lightning, and at night lights up the deep and wondrous drownings of the body like a star. And I hope those of you who've had some exposure to Platonic worldviews will hear in this poem Mary Oliver's contrast of flesh and spirit. That you will hear in her poem the ways that Platonism still undergirds essentially everything in Western society. And it would be fair for you to ask what on earth this has to do with media, and we'll get there. We're going to ground a little bit. But first, I'll just give you just a little bit about me. You may or may not be able to see this. This is really more for my benefit than anybody else's. Okay. So I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from Liberty University. I have a master's degree in professional counseling from Liberty University, and I am almost 3/4 of the way through my master's in theology at Phillips Theological Seminary. I am a licensed associate professional counselor, which means that I have a license to see clients for 3 to 5 years until I get my full and independent license. I am, it says a former editor, but that's not true. I'm a current and former editor of print books and blogs, especially for a long time until I started back to school in 2015, once my life changed forever and ever. I blogged pretty consistently and professionally, which is to say that was the source of my income. And I am mom to 5 kiddos. Those kiddos may be seen hence. Hadley, Jack, Amelia, Caroline, and Alice are 12, 10, 8, 6, and 4 years old, respectively. In this corner, you will see Alice of Wonderland fame. She is one of our favorites and my baby girl's namesake. Okay, who needs a refresher on Plato? Anybody? All right, who doesn't need a refresher on Plato, right? Okay, so, and I'm speaking specifically of Republic here, not the Timaeus. The Timaeus is Plato's sort of explanation of creation. But the Republic speaks to Plato's problem, which is to say, things change. And Plato was most significantly interested in the immutable and the things that don't change. And so for him, he grounded his understanding of immutability in mathematics. In the idea, in the concept of infinity, you can always add 1 to something and it keeps going. But so infinity itself is ineffable, it's unchangeable, it's immutable. And from that, he somehow extrapolated back to this philosophical view that what is impermeable, what is immutable, is the highest thing toward which one strives. So the reality of a thing, its essence, is called a form in Platonism. Again, he got that from an arithmetic mean, which is the idea of infinity. And a form is a spiritual thing rather than a material thing. So this thing right here that we call a chair is not a chair, right? It's not the essence of chair. It participates in the form of chair. Because long after this has been moth-eaten and rusted through, chair as a construct still exists. It's the hardest thing to get about Platonism, for me, this form of chair and whatever. Nonetheless, there are 3 forms in the end. There's beauty, truth, and the good. Okay, so beauty, truth, and the good funnel down into the good, because anything that is truly beautiful or truly true is, in the end, good. Now, Plato, of course, lived, he died in 348 BCE. So, of course, he did not participate in any arguments of the Christ, and in fact was subject to the Greco-Roman pantheon. So he believed in the gods, one assumes. There are some indications that Plato was, in fact, atheistic or at best agnostic. So for Plato, the perfect republic, a republic for him being a city, would be ruled by a philosopher king. Not oligarchs who were in charge when Plato was alive, right? It was just ruled by rich people. But for Plato, one who had been enlightened was the only one who had the moral authority and the education to serve as king. So for him, most people were chained to their ignorance, and they treat knowing people, or philosophers as it were, as blind fools. So it's not a great worldview, right? So what I've brought to share with you today about Plato is his allegory of the cave. Is anybody familiar with the allegory of the cave? Okay, good. So I'm gonna, if you'll just pass them around. I guess I could have split them half and half, but it's not that awkward. So you've read the allegory of the cave in here?
Read the first 6 or 7 pages of the print edition. It wasn't the whole thing, but that was pretty early on in the year, so it's been a while.
Okay, so then, excellent. So I don't have to read this to you. I only copied the first half of this. This is the version that's available on MIT's website.
It's probably the same section.
And the link is available at the bottom. And I didn't include the bottom of it because I didn't want you guys to read Plato's interpretation, right? But this is one of the things that I found in my constructive theology class, was this image of the cave itself. Because it's sort of hard for me, at least, to imagine that physical world, like how Plato envisaged the cave experience. And so he says, or the person who rendered this, is these are the prisoners, and they're chained, and they're facing the back wall of the cave. Okay? And the puppeteers are here, and the puppets, the marionettes, come down on this wall and are illumined by the fire behind. So this fire is casting the shadows of the puppets onto the wall. And the prisoners think the shadows are reality, which Plato would say, no, it's just a form. It's not a true thing. It's just an exemplar. It's not even an exemplar. It's just a product. A shadow is really an excellent explanation of it, of what is really real. And the puppeteers are the oligarchs, right? The people who are in charge. And then there's this diffuse sunlight that comes in through the mouth of the cave. And to get out, it's an uphill battle, right? You have to ascend uphill to get out of this cave. So the person who breaks free strains toward the light, goes uphill. Their eyesight adjusts. They learn to really see the world as it is in its truly spiritual form, right? Not in its fleshly form, as in the cave, but in its truly spiritual form. And then at some point during enlightenment, something within the person calls out to go back to the cave to seek to enlighten those who are still in chains. We don't know how the person ever got out of chains in the beginning. It's funny, but so here's where we are. So here is what I want you to tell me. Who or what is represented by each party? So who are the prisoners? Humans, yes. What is the diffused light? Or the diffused light is a form, right? Is it a form?
I guess, because you just said so.
I'm asking, is it a form? Is diffused light the form? Or does it participate in the form?
The latter.
Okay. I tend to take it as a form because the light, it may be diffused, but it is in essence the absolute truth. I would push back a little and say that the fire, it participates in the form of light. because fire is not the spiritual form of light, right? It's a physical, fleshly, earthly manifestation of light. I like your thinking process, though. What are the shadows?
What we see.
Perfect. It's absolutely right. Who are the puppeteers?
The only one answering.
Come on, now, come on, everyone else.
Somebody else can answer too. Who are the puppeteers?
The people who show us, well, they're, okay, so there's,
Doing great.
okay, so they're putting the puppets, and the light is shining and then the shadows.
Yes.
So,
So what is their role in the cave?
yeah. To hold the puppets to work for puppets.
Absolutely. Holds them captive.
Okay.
So in Plato's milieu, that would have been the oligarchs, right? Except, and this is something that doesn't often get touched on when we talk about the allegory of the cave, the oligarchs are subject to living in that same cave. They're no more enlightened than the slaves. They just happen not to be in chains. Because you read in the story that the slaves are bound even at their necks. They can't even turn their heads. Right? So they have to look only straight forward, whereas the oligarchs have the power to choose to leave. They're not chained, and yet choose instead of seeking enlightenment, they choose to live in that place where at least they have some modicum of power. Who's the former slave? What is that person's role? The philosopher. Who should be what? Who should be enlightened, and what role should the philosopher have? Absolutely. Good job, folks. I'm proud. That was good work. Okay. Mostly you. Good job to everyone, but mostly you. Okay, who remembers Augustine? Or Augustine, as y'all might say. I say Augustine. Okay. Okay. What can you tell me about Augustine, who lives some 700 years later than Plato? What do you remember about Augustine?
He like grew up in Carthage
Oh,
and then like converted to Christianity after like Saint Brenda
After Manichaeism.
and he's like a father of the church.
Okay. Where was he a bishop? Where?
Somewhere in Italy.
He was bishop of Hippo, which would be in modern day Algeria. But when you think about the Platonic worldview, the Platonic milieu, it's really important to remember that 7 or 8 centuries later, this is still the dominant worldview, and in fact continues until we get to the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era. So Plato holds a great deal of sway. And it's not until these early Reformation experiences that any other kinds of thought comes to the fore, right? People were good with Plato, it was working for them, and until you see the emergence of guilds, which eventually leads to the fall of feudalism, Plato is king. There, of course, Socrates and Aristotle will be influential, but Plato's worldview seems to reign supreme for, 1,600 years. Really important dude. But Augustine had some problems with Plato. So he agreed with him in that he also grew up in that milieu. He was exposed to that matrix. If you've ever read, you probably haven't, Dom Crossan, who is a low Christological theologian, also Roman Catholic, he says that, why did I start talking about Dom Crossan? Oh, matrix.
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 Yeah, matrix.
So matrix is defined as something about anyone's culture your average 5-year-old will know. So matrix, milieu, worldview, I use those terms fairly interchangeably. If I use a word you don't know, just ask. I'm in seminary, we use these ridiculous words. Ridiculous words. Oh. Okay, so he agreed with Plato in most instances because that was his cultural, it's the water he swam in, right? So for Augustine, truth too is located outside of humanity, like for Plato. But Plato didn't really give this absolute truth any name, any real form. It was this thing out there that existed that was separate and different from what fleshly things could inhabit. So education for Plato was strenuous and to be undertaken, but only certain people were able to be educated, and everyone had an educational limit. So there's only, you're only able to learn so much before your capacities were overshadowed, which is sort of sad, right? But if you think again about who was in charge and what it meant to have power, it makes a lot more sense. So in any case, for Augustine, instead of calling things forms, the sort of spiritual idea, he called them things. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But in Augustine, we learn about things through the sign. So it's just a little bit of a change in verbiage. So a thing, the idea of a chair, the form of a chair is a thing. And this is a sign of a chair, or for Plato, something that participates in the form of chair. I know it's sort of like, why are you telling me this? I hear you. And yet, there really is a real reason. So what Plato calls the good, what does Augustine call that? This highest thing for which we strive, that is above all humanity, that is spirit, not flesh. What does Augustine call the good? Amen. Good job. Good job. So Augustine calls the good God. So starting from that point, Augustine, because God is good, and for Augustine, God created out of nothing, which is the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. Since God created from nothing and God is wholly good, then anything that God could create would have the absolute potential for good. So for Augustine, original sin doesn't come from ignorance, right? Original sin comes from concupiscence. CONCUPISCENCE. And concupiscence is the love of fleshly things. So Augustine differentiated between uti and frue. Uti, is his idea that things are supposed to be things, not the highest thing, sorry, signs are supposed to be used, right? So anything that humans need or crave is to be used. And frue, F-R-U-E, is to enjoy. And there's only one thing for Augustine that is to be enjoyed. And what might that be? God. Good job. 2 for 2 on this section. You're like 7 for 7 on everything. Okay. So when we enjoy something that is not Trinity, for Augustine that is concupiscence, which equates to sin. However, for Augustine there is no such thing as true evil, because the continuum for him ranges from the fullness of the good to the privation or lack of the good. There's always the potential for good in something that even seems bad. So for Augustine, nothing is wholly evil. This is important. Therefore, the goal of the Christian life for Augustine is not to redeem a world of evil. It's not to pull it up out of this construct of what is evil, but is to strive toward, press toward, lean toward, lead toward what is ultimately good. Which, if you think about it, situates our task as Christians very differently than it being our job to overcome evil. Because the scripture says we're to overcome evil, but to overcome evil, how? With good. Okay. So what on earth does that have to do with the philosophy of media? It's an excellent question. I even had a cute little media tree for you with different media there. Okay, so media definitions. Means of communication as radio and television, you don't have to write this down, it's long, newspapers and magazines, and the internet that reach or influence people widely. So means of communication, essentially, for that one. Merriam-Webster defines it as a means of affecting or conveying something, effecting, EFF. Affecting, or conveying something. And then, because I'm a grammar nerd, I'm just going to tell you what Oxford Dictionary says, that the word media comes from the plural of medium, but it's increasingly used in the plural form medias instead of media, because taken together. So what happened linguistically here is that we have this word medium, which then takes on this Latin plural, media. But then sort of in English, have you seen that thing that says English doesn't borrow from other languages? We sneak up on it in dark alleys and steal its loose change. Right. So now we have medias, which is sort of funny, and the editor in me resists. Like, I'm just going to urge you to resist. But what I did like about this Oxford definition was the material or form used by an artist. So I'm going to ask you to remember that media inherently has a creative impulse. And I think that is because God created humans using God's creative impulse, which was then imparted into humanity. So we have a creative impulse because we reflect the Creator, who is the ultimate creative. And therefore, anything we do must be a creative endeavor. Even if we don't think of ourselves that way, like we don't make chalk drawings or something. But then media, of course, are concerning in some ways. I think we all might agree that there are some problems in the way that we experience media. So media are increasingly polarizing. You can read the same story on two different newspaper websites, one that is known to be very conservative and one that is known to be very liberal, and you'll come out with very different opinions. This polarization is contrary to the gospel as I understand it. I don't ask you to understand the gospel the same way I do. I also would agree that media are bathing the nation in negativity, that without some kind of balance, we risk nihilism, which is, that there's nothing, so why bother, and agnosticism at best. So can somebody tell me what spin is, or spin doctoring? Do you know what that means?
I've heard it, but I don't know.
Okay. So a spin doctor is defined as a person who represents typically a political situation in a way that is likely to help one side and vilify the other. So they're really seeking to divide, right? Like, this is who we are. So it's a very us versus them proposition. And again, to my mind, that is not the call of the gospel, right? The gospel is not us versus them. It's we, us. It's God created you and God created me in God's image. Therefore, we're all in this together kind of proposition. So then that, for me, the next logical question then is, what is good news? And I thought a lot about what good news is, because I'm not sure we really see that represented terribly frequently. So for me, when I hear the words good news, I always think of the gospel. I mean, that's the best news, right? So as believers in Jesus as the Christ, how do we understand good news? And more specifically, how do we offer good news in an increasingly negative cultural milieu without being naive or Pollyanna-ish or denying that things are not great in a lot of ways, but rather stand firm in God's reality. And so I'm going to ask you to think back to Plato and Augustine. Here you go. That spirit is reality and flesh is illusory, right? It's not wholly real. And so when I think about, I don't think about what I told you. So I do read Hebrew and Greek. As a theologian, that's a big part of your job, to be able to read the Bible in its original languages. I don't yet read Aramaic. It's next on the list. So our word gospel comes from euangelion, which is our Greek word. It means good news, and it's defined in Strong's as the good news of the coming of the Messiah, the gospel itself, and the genitive after it expresses sometimes the giver, God, or sometimes the subject, the Messiah. So in Greek, a genitive is just an apostrophe S, right? So somebody's something. So the good news of God, or the good news of the Messiah, is how that would be rendered in English from the Greek. But sometimes the good news is the human transmitter. So in the scriptures, we see evangelion sometimes as the apostle, which I think should give us all hope, because what Strong's Concordance here is telling us is that you can be good news. Your person can be good news. Or at least the spirit inside you, if you don't think the flesh can be good. At least the spirit inside you can be the good news of God. So then I would offer you a philosophy of life-giving media consumption. So I would ask these 4 points. To 1, clarify your values. What is out of bounds? What is out of bounds for you will not be what is out of bounds for me for various reasons. Socioeconomic factors, age, a stage in life. I'm a mother with 5 children. I'm not a teenager anymore. My own capacity to handle or tolerate things that are painful. As a therapist, I have to have a really high capacity for dealing with stuff like that. And so you have to know what is out of bounds, what makes you unsafe, and what takes you into dangerous waters. I would ask you to model behaviors for your peers, and not just your peers, because my children model for me what it means to follow God in some ways that I haven't yet learned. I would ask you to keep the conversation open with influential persons in your life, but also to consider what you share with others, because your speech shares news too. I don't know if you guys have read the 7 Mountain Prophecy, but in it, Johnny Enlow talks about having, being high on the mountain, middle of the mountain, or low on the mountain. And high are the CNN and Fox News, the way that, you can broadcast to millions upon millions of people. And there's smaller media outlets that reach fewer persons. And then there's low on the mountain. And while he doesn't necessarily come out and say it, my contention is that our individual speech is media. You're always broadcasting something. The way that you choose to speak, the things that you choose to say, to whom you choose to say them, when and why. All of those really make a difference in the way that we all perceive things. And so for me, one of my challenges this year has been to work really hard at reading things that are not on my side of the political spectrum. Because I recognize in myself, A, that polarization is not healthy, and B, that no party has the true truth. It just is not the case. So for those who merely are consuming, and I say merely in scare quotes, media, I would ask you to consider it as a triangle. So at the top of the triangle is balance. How does engaging in this media experience fit in with other activities in my life? And then one of the legs is engagement. Will this media connect me with others or expand my world in important ways? So will it connect me with others or expand my world in important ways? And the third leg is quality. Is this among the best offerings on the topic? And is this the best way to learn? I'm not asking you only to consume media for learning purposes, because heaven knows in high school you've got enough of that. But I would ask you to consider those 3 things in balance with one another, not prioritizing or privileging one over the others. And so my media context, I started blogging in 2008 with a company that sold anabolic steroids, legally, for sure, and probably some illegally. There was no way for us really to know. And in that context, I wrote essentially on health and wellness. It was what was really foremost in my mind for those few years, learning as much as I could and grinding my own grain and making a spinach smoothie every day. I miss that sometimes now that I have 5 kids and a job and 5 classes this semester. So my function, because I operate on the premise that all truth is God's truth, is that in any context, I'm able to bring truth. My job is simply to tailor it for the audience while maintaining the dignity of what truth means. So if I had to edit a piece that was extremely hyperbolic, I'd try to bring it down, bring the tone down, so that A, it wasn't offensive, and B, that it was factually accurate. I don't do well with people trying to scare me. It always feels like manipulation, and so I tune out. But that premise that all truth is God's truth was really sort of my North Star. that belief has sustained me through some really challenging times in school and in life, that anything really is true is of God. Again, back to Plato, right? Back to this idea that the good is God. So after that blog shut down, I started my own blog about health and wellness, ended up moving toward my own journey toward emotional wellness and healing, which, as you can imagine, I'm a therapist, and don't let anybody who's a therapist tell you they didn't do it because of their own pain, because they did. And in that, I think God used that time to clarify my gifts and call, and challenge me to live in truth so that I could share truth. And for me, the guiding verse of that time was, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, which is Matthew 12:24, and I think in Luke 6 maybe. Because what was in me was, at the end, what needed sanctification so that I could speak God's truth. And it really profoundly challenged me to become a person whose word meant something. And so I'm just about out of time, so I just want to leave you with Proverbs 4, 6, and 7. I'll read it first in Hebrew, and then I will read it for you in English. So if you have any inclination toward Hebrew, let this encourage you, and if you don't care about Hebrew, well, maybe you will at some point. Al ta'adbecha v'tishmurecha, achavecha v'titzrecha. Reshit chokma k'nei chokma, uvakol kenyanach k'nei binach. Do not forsake her, that is wisdom, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. Do you have questions? I know we're running out of time, so I want to leave space for questions. Okay, so Miss Karen knows how to be in touch with me if you have questions. Thank you guys for all of your attention. I really appreciate it. Your little shining high school faces. It's been 20 years, guys. 20 years. So thank you.